The engine has been completely cleaned, then repainted with the original factory colors that we purchased from our local auto supply store in convenient spray cans. We are quite confident that the engine will run as well as it did when it was new. The carburetor has been covered to prevent dirt from entering. When the engine has been positioned properly, the through bolts are inserted and the nuts are attached. We then elevate the transmission with our floor jack and attach the transmission crossmember to the brackets welded to the chassis. We use the original Ford through bolts and nuts and tighten the crossmember securely to the frame. We then lower the transmission so that the studs on the rubber mount pass through the center of the crossmember. The original factory nuts are installed and tightened with the appropriate tools. We then fully tighten the front motor mounts, nuts, and bolts. Our engine and transmission have now been installed. Once the engine has been installed, the necessary weight has been placed on the chassis that will make it easier for us to install the front springs. The rubber spring insulators have been installed in the crossmember and have been taped in place. We put the springs on the lower control arms, making certain that the end of the spring that we tapered earlier is not more than a ½ inch from the front of the depression on the lower control arm. Our floor jack is placed under the lower control arm and slowly elevated. The front rotors, wheel bearings, calipers, brake pads, and rubber hoses have been thoroughly inspected and cleaned. Any questionable parts have been replaced, and of course we have given the whole assembly a fresh coat of paint. We continue to compress the front spring carefully so that the stud of the ball joint on the upper control arm passes through the mounting hole of the wheel spindle. The castle nut is then threaded onto the stud, then tightened and torqued to original specifications, and new cotter pins are installed. Having installed the front springs, we can now attach the front struts to their brackets and to the lower control arm. The rubber bushings have been inspected, and if necessary, new bushings can be purchased from our local Ford parts department. The threaded ends of the struts at the rear are inserted through the holes in the strut brackets that were previously bolted to the chassis. The original nut and large metal washer, along with the inside rubber bushing, are placed on the strut from the back side of the strut bracket, and the nut is tightened. The two studs on the front of each strut are pushed through the mounting holes in the lower control arms, and the nuts are threaded on. We tighten the bolts, and we will use a torque wrench and tighten all front end bolts to original specifications. Our front suspension is almost complete. We have decided to replace the front shock absorbers with new units that we have purchased from our local auto supply store. Using the new top mounting hardware and bushings furnished with our new shocks, we insert the shock absorber up through the lower control arm, guiding it through the center of the springs. The original Ford bolt passes through the control arm and lower shock mounting bushing. It is then secured with the original nut. We then place our floor jack under the lower control arm and compress the spring assembly just enough to allow us to pass the upper mounting stud through the mounting hole. It is located in the center of the spring mounting recess of the cross member. The rubber bushing and washer are placed on the stud and the new nut is threaded on. The nuts are then tightened to their correct specifications. We repeat the same procedure on the passenger side. At this time, we secure the original Ford front brake hose mounting brackets to each side of the chassis, following the directions in the instruction manual. Of course, we have inspected the rubber brake hoses, and when necessary, replace them with new hoses. We connect the fittings on the metal brake lines to the fittings on the rubber brake hoses and tighten them securely. The original Ford drive shaft is too long to fit into our new chassis. Shortening the unit is left up to a professional. Checking our yellow pages, we locate a shop that can handle the job. Before we send the unit out, we need to determine the correct measurements. We insert the drive shaft yoke onto the transmission shaft, pushing it forward, allowing approximately 1 or 2 inches of play before the yoke bottoms out against the transmission shaft. Using a tape measure, we find the distance between the front universal at the center of the universal bearing back to the center of the bearing mount recess on the rear differential flange. Taking the drive shaft to the shop we've located, we give them this measurement. We have also had our drive shaft balanced, and the universal joints were checked thoroughly. With our drive shaft in hand, all that's necessary for installation is to slip the splined yoke onto the transmission shaft, then push forward on the drive shaft, and slide the rear universal cups into the recessed area on the companion flange of the differential. Once this has been done, we insert the original Ford U-bolts and tighten the nuts with the appropriate open end or box wrench. Installation of our drive shaft has now been completed. Moving back to the front of our chassis, we locate the left and right radiator brackets that are furnished with the Replicar's assembly kit. We place the brackets into position, lining up the holes in the brackets with the pre-tapped holes in the chassis. These are located on the frame rails just inside the front cross member spring mounts. We use 3/4 inch diameter by 1 inch long fine threaded bolts, normally referred to as a 20 thread, to attach the brackets to the chassis. When necessary, we slightly enlarge the bracket holes with our electric drill with a rotary rasp that we can find in any hardware store. Carefully, we tighten the bolts, making sure that we don't over-tighten them and strip the threads of the bolt or the threads tapped in the chassis. A trick we use here is to put a few drops of oil on the threads before assembly. Now that we've installed the radiator brackets, we can mount our radiator to the brackets. We use our electric drill and a 1/4 inch drill bit and drill 2 holes in the rear flange on each side of the radiator. We are careful and make sure that the radiator does not come into contact with the frame. Since we have decided to use an air conditioning system in our car, we had the upper hose neck moved to the opposite side. We checked our yellow pages and found a radiator shop that performed the work. At the same time, they thoroughly cleaned and painted the unit. At times, we find Ford radiators that may require some other slight modifications. An existing radiator may have been replaced in our donor car. We place the radiator from the front into position against the brackets and secure with 1/4 inch diameter by 3/4 inch or 1 inch long bolts with flat washers, lock washers, and nuts, and tighten the unit into place. We measure the distance between the upper and lower radiator to engine hose connections, allowing enough room to clear any obstructions. Generally, we use universal flexible hoses of the appropriate length found at our auto supply store, along with stainless steel hose clamps. The hoses are secured to the engine and radiator. Next, We reconnect the two automatic transmission lines to the transmission and then to the fittings located at the bottom of the radiator. Engine coolant will be used to fill the system before we run the engine. Next, we move to the passenger side of the engine compartment, where we find the exhaust manifold. Earlier, when we disassembled our donor car, we determined that the only reusable piece was the exhaust header pipe that bolts to the manifold. At this point, we check with the State Motor Vehicle Department to find out any necessary emission requirements. After our car is finished, we will take it to a local muffler shop and have the exhaust system completed. If the complete exhaust system were usable, we would refer to the instruction manual and make the necessary modifications and install it. Or we might build the rest of the system ourselves, obtaining the necessary parts from our local auto supply store. It's very important to make sure that the exhaust system is supported by the appropriate hangers and that the system does not come into contact with any part of the chassis. If our car came with a catalytic converter, we would reuse it if the State Motor Vehicle Department required its retention. The appropriate wrench is used to tighten the nuts that secure the exhaust header pipe to the exhaust manifold. The accelerator bracket that bolts to the engine just behind the carburetor requires modification in order to clear the brake master cylinder. We place the bracket in a vise and, following the instruction manual, we use a hacksaw to cut a V-shaped notch in the bracket. A pair of pliers is used to remove the piece. Then we bend the piece upward and together to close the notch. At times, this can get a little tricky, so we test the piece by placing it on the engine. Once we're sure that the fit is correct, we drill 2 holes and attach a small strap to hold the unit together, or alternatively, the piece can be welded.